I think it's week 12. And so we have looked at several aspects of the Psalms, like how they're structured, right, and why that's important. We looked at the organization of the Psalter, how the book as a whole is organized. We talked about the fact that it has a messianic structure pointing us to Christ. And we looked at how the book of Psalms connects to Christ, several ways that it connects to Jesus Christ. So I just want to pause here because we've covered a lot of material, and we will circle back and do another review before we close the class out. But I want to make sure before we move into this next section, because we're going to shift gears a little bit this morning. So I wanted to see if there are any questions or anything that's confusing to you about what we've already covered. I know, we didn't meet last week, so you have to kind of like refresh your brains back a couple of weeks. But is there anything I can help with before we shift gears and talk about the language and the poetry of the songs? No?
There's just so much.
Yeah, it's a massive amount of information. I mean, we're moving very quickly, but hopefully some of the things that you're being exposed to have been valuable to you in your reading of the Psalms. And I'm hoping that this will be as well. This is maybe a more technical part of the course in terms of the poetry of the Psalms, but I think it's important to understand when we're reading the Psalms that it's poetic genre, right? It's poetic literature. So we don't read these in the same way that we would read a letter, for example. They are songs, they are poetry, they are poetic in a sense, but let's look at in what way, because there's some interesting things about the poetry of the Psalms which are useful to us when we start to interpret them and apply them in our lives that are useful to know. So in their book, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart say the following about the Psalms as poetry. And by the way, if you're looking for a pretty good book on starting to really study the Bible more methodically, this is a really well-written book for that. But they say perhaps the most important thing to remember in reading or interpreting the Psalms should also be the most obvious. They are poems, musical poems. So, Fee and Stewart are the most important thing that you need to understand when approaching this book is that it's poetry. On the other hand, James Kugel, who's a literature scholar, in his book, The Great Poems of the Bible, says this: I don't particularly like to talk about compositions like the Psalms or prayers or prophetic speeches as poems, since this word is in any case likely to summon up a host of associations inappropriate to these texts. They are really not very much like what we think of as poetry in the mainstream Western tradition. So here you have Fee and Stewart saying the most important thing you need to know about the Psalms is that they are poetry, and you have Kugel saying they're so unlike poetry that we shouldn't probably even call them poetry. And so which is it? Well, I think both. They're both pointing to something that I think is important that we have to keep in mind when we look at the Psalms. So there are several ways in which the Psalms are excellent examples of poetry, but it's not the kind of poetry that we tend to get in the Western tradition. And we're going to look at this a little bit more deeply. So if you're not quite grasping onto what I'm saying yet, that's okay. We'll get there. They're poetry in this sense, that this is figurative language. So there are certain conventional forms and structures that the psalmists will repeatedly use to make their points and convey their meaning. They're not letters, they're not narratives or direct language, right? You're dealing with figurative language, image-based sort of language. But they're not what we typically think of as poetry in the English tradition, for example, because the forms and structures are different from what you find in English. And so I always feel like most people, when we get to this, don't, it's probably been a while since you've thought about English poetry. How many of you have given any thought to English poetry recently? Yeah, that's what I thought. So let's talk about poetry for a minute, and then we'll shift gears to show you how the Psalms are and are similar and different to the poetry that we may be familiar with. English poetry, like most poetry in the Western traditions, characterized primarily by forms that emphasize meter. Okay? Meter and rhyme are the two real defining features of poetry in the Western tradition. And so the poets use rhyme and meter along with the ideas in the poem to really create the force of the language, what's happening in the poem. So for example, this is a very famous poem. Has anybody heard of this poem before, this Robert Frost poem? Yeah. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. So this is like a classic English poem. Well, how does it work? What's happening here? Well, first of all, you have this end rhyme. Know, though, here snow, queer near lake year. So you'll see that noted by the letters A, B, A, B, B, C, A. Those letters correspond to the sounds. Know, though, here, snow. So there's this sort of ending rhyme to this that helps the thing flow, right? You may also notice that each line has 8 syllables that alternate in stress. So it's do you get that? There's a rhythm. There's a musical rhythm to the line, which is very common in English poetry. And so think about the imagery here. What is this poem about? Chris is like, I don't know. So he stops in the woods, but what is he doing when he comes across these woods? He's riding a horse, right? Listen. You can hear the horse. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. It's click, 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 click. So the poet is using the sounds, the end rhyme structure, and the imagery all working together to convey this emotion of this moment. Did you see that? So that's pretty common in English poetry, at least with good poems. You're not going to get that necessarily on a Hallmark card, but Robert Frost, this is pretty good. So you're going to get that kind of thing. And so here's another example of this. Even when there's no end rhyme, that meter is so important, that the interplay between meter and sound. So listen to this. This is another very famous poem, Alfred Lord Tennyson, Come Down, O Maid. Sweeter thy voice, but every sound is sweet. Myriads of rivulets hurrying through the lawn, the moan of doves and immemorial elms, and murmuring of innumerable bees. So that particular poem has 10 syllables that alternate, unstressed, stressed, which, by the way, that's the most common rhythm in English poetry, this sort of unstressed, stressed rhythm. But notice how Tennyson stacks S and M sounds to connect the rhythm to the image. He's focusing on these sounds and then uses that language. So what is he talking about? Like, you're walking along, you see these doves and these bees in the tree. Now listen to this. You can hear the bees. The moan of doves and immemorial elms and murmuring of innumerable bees. You see what he's doing there? So in English, this interplay between meter and end rhyme and the imagery is very important. And it is in most Western literature. And so Hebrew poetry isn't like this exactly. It does use some of these techniques, but not the way that English does. So the metrical forms in the Psalms are not as intricate as that, and they rely less on these patterns of sounds that we expect when we're reading English poetry. And the Hebrew poems tend to focus on the relationship of the ideas in the lines rather than the sound in the lines. So there's a sense in which you can write a really good English poem, and it doesn't necessarily have to make a lot of sense, right? You know, was Lewis Carroll, beware the Jabberwock, my friend? Like, what? It's just nonsense. But it works as a poem. Like that, that wouldn't work in Hebrew poetry. Hebrew poetry, especially the Psalms, differ in a couple other ways. Where our poems tend to emphasize creativity and uniqueness, the Psalms tend to focus on repetition and a commonality of form. So what I'm saying by that, and hopefully I don't want to get too academic here, so stop me if you don't understand. When you are reading or evaluating English poetry, one of the things that is sort of remarkable about English poetry is like a new observation, right? Very creative observation. So in Hebrew poetry, that's not really the case. It's a repetition, and so slight differences of observation over the same common themes really pack a lot of the meaning, really pack a lot of power in there. And so our poems tend to be very flowery in language, and the Psalms are very short and very direct. So if you actually think about the Psalms as poetry, they're not poetic in the sense of having this flowery language. They're very powerful language, very compact language, but it's not frivolous language at all. You don't have language being used ornamentally. You really have language being used forcefully. It's a different kind of approach. Do you understand what I'm saying? What I'm getting at? Kind of. We'll see. But the other thing is that a lot of Western poetry is very metaphysical, very reflective on these grand themes. But Hebrew poetry tends to be very observational and anti-metaphysical. In English poetry, in the poetry we usually encounter, we might be observing something in the natural world and making some sort of connection to some broader theme of goodness or beauty or something like that. In Hebrew, there's no distinction between those things. God is seen in every mundane circumstance of the human experience. Right? So there, in our minds, there's this there's like these theological themes and these metaphysical themes and these kind of deep reality themes, and then there's the day-to-day stuff we deal with. The psalmists don't think that way. That's completely foreign to the psalmists, because what they see is that in every action, there's no disconnect between the spiritual realm and the physical realm, right? You don't have this sort of bifurcation that we operate with. We tend to talk about it even in the Western tradition as like separated. Like there's the material world and the spiritual world. The Hebrews it's all the world and it's all God's world. The material is spiritual, and the spiritual in many ways is material because God is directly involved in what's happening with your crops, what's happening with your animals, what's happening in your life. So this kind of poetic disconnect doesn't exist there. Okay, I'll just stop there. I know this is a little bit of probably not stuff you think about very often, but it will become hopefully helpful by the time we get to the end. Any questions on that? Chris doesn't look convinced. He's like, yeah, I don't know.
Well, I understand when it's not really rhythm and rhyme, but the Psalms are directly based on God. Everything's about God.
Yeah.
I understand that. There's no rhythm. There's no rhyme in Psalms.
There is some, but it's not the same thing that they're not poems in that sense.
So if I look at Psalms, I'm more with the guy the second guy.
Well, they're both right.
Yeah, but I see more of the second guy than the first two guys.
Okay, well, you will see as we unfold this over the next week or two that they are poetry, and it's important to understand that. But yes, I'm glad that you realize it's not about the sort of floweriness of the language and the intricate meters and forms of the language so much as the ideas.
You explain it well, I understand it.
So why do we say they're poetry then? So there are some structures that are being used, which we're going to look at. But the key thing is, it's very intentional, figurative language. That's why, because they are able to communicate not just facts and observations about the world, but emotions and attitudes in very short phrases. You have very distilled down, compact language in the Psalms, just like any poetry. It's very powerful language. I mean, there's a reason in every culture that the earliest literature that you have recorded is poetry, because poetry's magical in that way, in that you can express a lot of information in a very compact way using figurative language that you can't really. It's sort of like, you hear people say, hey, if you have to explain a joke, it didn't work. If you have to explain a poem, it didn't work. You know what I mean? Like, because you'd have to write, like that Robert Frost poem, there are entire books, 200-300 pages long, explaining that poem. It's like, So all this in poetry is able to pack a lot in a short period of time. And so in that way, these are absolutely poetic. This is absolutely poetic language, and maybe the pinnacle of poetic language, because the concepts that are communicated in the Psalms are just tremendously compact. So if we want to, we'll look at this. So like, how does this work? If we wanted to communicate the burdens and worries that a king would face, we could go on and on to describe his responsibilities, the threats from rivals, and all these other concerns that a king would have to deal with, right? I mean, we could spend quite a bit of time. We could mention how challenging those burdens are and how difficult it is for a man in that situation to sleep at night, right? We could really go into detail. But a poet like Shakespeare can communicate all of that with 8 words. Uneasy lies the head that wears a crown. You see how much is in that phrase? Like, if you really start to think about that, there's just pages and pages and pages of explanation that is unnecessary because he captures it right there. Similarly, when King David is surrounded by enemies and desires for God to protect him, rather than detail all the truths about God's love and power and devotion, which he desires to draw upon. I mean, David could go on and on about God's promises to him and God's faithfulness in the past, and David's love for God and all of those things. But he does this in 16 words. Keep me as the apple of your eye, hide me in the shadow of your wings. That imagery captures paragraphs and paragraphs full of explanation of the relationship that David desires to have with God, right? So these images are powerful because they capture a lot of experience in a short way.
To me, that line is poetic.
What is poetic? Absolutely, it's the height of poetry. Because in those two images, keep me as the apple, the center of your eye, don't take your eyes off me, hide me in the shadow of your wings, you know, like a mother bird, you know, protecting her young. You can read huge sections of narratives in First and Second Kings, First and Second Samuel, about David's life and his relationship with God and the desire that he continually expresses to be within God's will. But this right here captures all of that sentiment, right? And so yeah, it's very poetic. And so, although the Psalms sometimes appear to be sort of simple and unsophisticated compared to other poetry, I would argue that that's not the case. What we want to focus on in the Psalms are the comparison of ideas that point us to deep truths that you can meditate on really the rest of your life. And so I think literary scholar Robert Alter captures this well when he says this. The Psalms are, of course, poems written out of deep and often passionate faith. What I am proposing is that the poetic medium made it possible to articulate the emotional freight, the moral consequences, the altered perception of the world that flowed from this monotheistic belief in compact verbal structures that could in some instances seem simplicity itself. So what is he saying? Let's look at this. He's saying that by using these poetic forms, the Psalms are able to articulate emotional freight, that is, just the depth of feeling that the author has, the moral consequences. None of these are sort of indifferent, right? All of these are connected to some ethical reality. And the altered perception of the world. What do you think he means by altered perception of the world through faith? Yeah, there's that, but I think it has to do with seeing the Lord in all of these things, which don't we experience that all the time, right? The world doesn't see what we see. We can look at the same events and we're perceiving it very differently. Our perception is altered by our faith.
Our perception is like through the eyes of God.
Yeah, or what he's revealed to us. And so he's saying, look, by using poetry in very short sentences, or not even sentences, in very short phrases, these psalmists are able to communicate this whole world of faith and emotion and observation about what God's doing in the world and their place in it. And so I think they are poetry. And so why do we cover all of this? Because understanding how it works is critical to making sure we interpret them correctly. And so now we're going to shift gears to get a little more practical in terms of understanding the poetry and how it works. So any questions before we move on to that? They seem simplistic, but they're not. You know what I mean?
But they're laid out, and we say it's repetitive in different ways, different forms to where it gets the message across, but I think it's to convey it to his people. So he gave his precepts one way or another.
Absolutely.
One would be or the other.
Yeah, absolutely. So, excuse me. Some water.
Would that altered perception be like you can have two people in the same situation and one could be totally devastated and the other one could be praising God because of that relationship with God. Same set of circumstances, but yet your outlook and how your relationship with God affects
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. And it goes to every experience we have. I mean, think about Jesus when he's in front of Pilate. Pilate says, "Don't you realize I have the power of life or death over you?" And Jesus says, "You have no power other than that which has been given to you." It's like, well, depending on who's looking at that scene, it's like, wait a minute, that's a very different
You're talking to the
person.
one that has the power over you.
Right, but Pilate doesn't perceive it that way. He doesn't even understand what's going on there.
That's true.
So, all right, well, so let's dig into, okay, how do you actually use this practically, the stuff that I shared here? The rhythm of the Hebrew poetry comes primarily not from the syllables and sounds, but it does have a rhythm. And the rhythm is established through a pattern of ideas. And so the ideas are the primary thing you want to keep in focus as you're trying to interpret the Psalms and understand them. So unlike letters or narratives, it's not sentences that carry the meaning in the Psalm. So like when you're reading a letter, a sentence is the primary building block of the meaning of a paragraph, right? Each sentence carries its own point, its own meaning. That's not how the Psalms work. Rather, they're organized into lines, and each line is divided into one or two parts called sticks. So for example, this is two sticks from line 46. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. The bulk of the meaning is carried by the relationships of the sticks to the line. So the line is this whole thing. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. So that line is composed of these two sticks. And it's the relationship between the two that conveys the meaning. So do you see, this doesn't work like a regular sentence, but it's putting these two things next to each other and seeing how they relate. That is what is really the most important determiner of the meaning. The meaning and the emphasis of what the psalmist is getting at are drawn out through this relationship. So this alignment of these things is usually called parallelism, because they're put in parallel, right? We all know what parallel lines are. Well, these sticks are brought alongside each other, and that's how the meaning is built. Probably the most important thing you can learn in this lesson, in terms of the literature, the poetry of the Psalms, is how parallelism works. Because the entire Psalter, all these Psalms are built on these parallel forms. So you really want to, if you're getting in Psalms, like, what does this mean? Understanding parallelism is going to help you interpret these things more than any of the other points that I'm going to share with you.
Can you have more than two sticks?
Oh yeah.
To equal,
Yep.
equal one line? It equals the meaning?
Yeah, sometimes there's three. Yeah, you can
It's
see
almost
some.
an equation.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Two sticks equals one line. Equals
Actually,
meaning.
an equation is a good way of thinking about it, because the two are balancing one another or offsetting one another. Let's look at it. So there are 6 main types of parallelism that you'll find in the Psalms. And each of the types of parallels, the second part often adds emphasis to something in the first part. And that's good to know, because if one part of it is difficult to understand, you can often figure out what they mean by looking at the parallel part. Do you see what I mean? Because sometimes they say things and you're like, what is that? But if you look at what's paralleled with it, often that will clarify what's going on. So if we look at, let's look at these different types of parallelism. The first type of parallelism that we're going to see in the Psalms is called synonymous parallelism. Synonymous means what? The same. Yep. So it's the repetition in the second part of what's already been expressed in the first part. The two parts communicate the same idea in different words, and so they work like a 1-2 punch, like two jabs that are the same. Psalm 18:4, the cords of death encompassed me, the torrents of destruction assailed me. So do you see those are both of those sticks are saying the same thing in different words. Do you see that? So he's not saying these are two totally different experiences he had. He's using two different ways to describe the same experience. Psalm 103:10. He does not deal with us according to our sins, nor repay us according to our iniquities. Same idea in different words. Okay, and so Psalm 135:4. And the Lord has chosen Jacob for himself, Israel as his own possession. Same idea, right? So when we say the meaning is really built out of the relationship between the two, you have this sort of one-two punch kind of thing going on. You have a particular observation or a particular statement. It's repeated in different words in the second part, which just sort of doubles down on it, right? Do you see that? It's just sort of like a doubling down on the point, and often the second time will just sort of give additional emphasis to what's already been said. Does that one make sense? That one's usually fairly easy. They're the same. Two lines that are saying the same thing. The next one's usually pretty easy too to identify, which is antithetic or contrasting parallels. You get this a lot also. A contrasting parallel is when the second part contrasts with the first part. Again, there's this 1-2 punch. Psalm 1:6. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. Now, those are the opposite, right? In what way is the wicked perishing the opposite of the Lord knowing something about the righteous? Let's just work through this for a second. Yeah, well, he certainly knows about the wicked. So what's the contrast here?
The nose refers to relationship.
That's right. He's not talking about he's aware of them, but he has this relationship with them. But the wicked, they perish. Okay, Psalm 34:10. The young lions suffer want and hunger, but those who seek the Lord lack no good thing. So, the opposite, right? What's being compared there? Young lions and those who seek the Lord.
Desire and fulfillment.
Which of these two which of these two do you think are the most capable of getting food for themselves, would you think? A young strong lion?
The ones that seek the Lord.
Well, but that's the point that's being made. Is
Imagery.
even some of these young lions end up being hungry, but those who trust in the Lord do not.
Lacks no good thing.
That's the key word, the but. There's like a teeter-totter. These are like a teeter-totter, like you have a but or an and, some sort of transition that gives you the opposite. Psalm 62:4b, they bless with their mouths, but inwardly they curse.
Pharisee.
So blessing and cursing are parallel, opposites, right? And inwardly and mouths are parallel opposites. So it's the opposite. So antithetic parallels work where the second phrase kind of counteracts the first phrase. Do you see that? Those are usually, those two, I think most people find those the easier ones to identify. So the other ones we're going to look at might require a little more thought. Climactic parallelism is where a poet or the psalmist builds a climactic effect by a subsequent repetition of elements from one part to the other. These are like poetic staircases that just continue to escalate the emphasis. So Psalm 29:1, ascribe to the Lord, O heavenly beings, Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. So now sometimes people will look at this and go, well, that's a synthetic parallel, right? Those are saying the same thing, essentially. It is, but we would call this climactic because you see that repetition of words. It's just continuing to build off that same repetition. So it's not wrong that it's saying that there's a synthetic element to it, but it's a little bit more, there's a little bit more structure here than just repeating the idea. What's that?
Because it builds up the climatic.
Yeah, it builds up. It builds up. So Psalm 93, the floods have lifted up, O Lord. The floods have lifted up their voice. The floods lift up their roaring. You see that? It builds intensity in the point. So there you have a 3-stick line. Chris, you see that one?
Yes.
Psalm 96, 1 and 2. Oh, sing to the Lord a new song. Sing to the Lord all the earth. Sing to the Lord, bless his name. Sing, sing, sing. Benny Goodman. No. we got this building of emphasis that happens when you have that same phrase introduced, and then you have each time you're just adding another layer of, why or what, either way. So you guys good with that? I'm just going to stop here, and we'll pick up here next time.
It's amazing that as you teach us what you find out about the Psalms, that you never looked at it this way. You read them and, wherever, certain things I did, I read, but I didn't look at them like this. It definitely gives you a better understanding.
Yeah, I think the better you understand these sort of types of parallelism, when you get into a psalm, if you go back to what we learned at first, what kind of psalm is this? Is it a thanksgiving or a lament or whatever? Then you start to look at these parallelisms. Sometimes you read something, you go, what's going on here? You go, wait a minute, all right, let's slow down. Okay, here's how they're building the meaning in this psalm that helps you kind of narrow down, this is what the main point is, this is what they're trying to
Yeah,
convey.
that'll help for those. There are songs that are a little more intense or a little more harder to understand, maybe.
Yeah,
They're
absolutely.
not clicking in your mind,
Yep. Yep, break them down.
Yeah.
Take it into, break it into pieces and build up your understanding. That way is often helpful. Now that doesn't mean that, every single, this isn't like a secret decoder ring that's, unlock every single detail, but it will allow you to really make sure you're understanding these Psalms in their contexts. What is the author doing? How is he doing that? And so what's the main point? And if you can do that much, it certainly gets you on the right track. So, all right, God bless.